Daughter develop into a rider of Olympic standard. Applause, she's a regular visitor whenever Princess Anne is taking part. Princess Anne had always loved her horses more than anything in the world. She spent most of her quiet days in the royal stables, caring for them with a tenderness few ever saw. Her love for animals came from her mother, Queen Elizabeth Roman II, who had passed that passion down like a royal gift. But one cold morning at Gatcombe Park, something strange happened inside those peaceful stables. The royal guards trained to protect stumbled upon something no one expected. Something that left them frozen in disbelief. What exactly did they find hidden in Princess Anne's stable? And why was it so shocking? The princess and her love for horses. Princess Anne woke at 5 every morning, not because she had to, because the horses were waiting. Her mother understood this. Queen Elizabeth Roman II had given her daughter many things, but the love of horses was the greatest gift. Anne remembered watching her mother in the stables as a child, brushing down her favorite mare, whispering things she never said anywhere else. Now Anne did the same. Gatcombe Park belonged to her, but the stables were her real home. She pulled on her boots and walked across the dewy grass. The air smelled like autumn. Inside the horses nickered softly, Bella first, then Thunder, then Whisper. They knew her footsteps. "Good morning, my loves," she said. She'd competed in the Olympics once back in '76. People always brought it up at dinners like it was her greatest achievement, but that wasn't why she rode. She rode because horses didn't care about titles or protocol. They just wanted presence, honesty, a gentle hand. Anne spent 2 hours there every morning feeding them, talking to them, listening to them breathe. Mark, her head groom, arrived at 7. The stable hands came after, but those first hours were hers alone. Lately, though, something felt different. The horses were restless. Bella kept looking toward the back entrance. Thunder paced his stall. Even calm Whisper seemed on edge. "What is it?" Anne asked, stroking Bella's neck. The mare just blinked at her. Anne walked to the back of the stable and looked out toward the woods. Nothing there, just trees, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in her chest like a stone. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Too many late nights, too much stress from royal duties, that was all. But when she left that morning, she looked back at the stable. The horses were all watching her through their stall windows, waiting for something or watching for something. Anne had known these animals for years. She trusted their instincts more than she trusted most people. And right now they were afraid. What did they know that she didn't? A change in the routine. Mark found the door unlocked on Tuesday. He stood there staring at it for a full minute. He'd locked it himself the night before. He was certain Thomas hadn't come back. Nobody had, but the door was open. Mark walked through the stable slowly. Everything looked normal, but Rosie was agitated, stamping and tossing her head, and there was straw scattered near the back stalls where it shouldn't be. When Princess Anne arrived, he told her immediately. She listened without interrupting, then followed him through the stable. She noticed things he'd missed. A bucket moved, scratches on a window latch. She ran her finger along them, but said nothing. The night guard started reporting strange things. George, a former soldier who didn't scare easily, came to Mark on Wednesday afternoon. He'd heard footsteps the night before around 1:00 in the morning near the back stalls. Patterson, the other night guard, confirmed it. Both men looked serious. These weren't the type to imagine things. Mark started staying later. On Thursday night, he sat in the dark office and watched. The horses were moving constantly, not sleeping like they should. Around midnight, he heard something, a soft creak from the back door. He grabbed his torch and walked toward the sound. The horses watched him pass. When he reached the back entrance, it was shut tight, locked, but the air smelled wrong, like wet earth and rotting leaves. Friday morning, Thomas found them, footprints in the mud by the back entrance, fresh ones. They came straight out of the woods, crossed to the stable door, and stopped. Mark crouched down and looked at them closely. Adult-sized, deep impressions made during the night. He stood up and stared at the woods. The trees were thick and dark. Anything could be hiding in there. Thomas ran to get the princess. Anne arrived 10 minutes later. She looked at the footprints for a long time without speaking. Her face was calm, but Mark knew her well enough to see the worry in her eyes. She turned to Mark and said just one word. Security, the midnight disturbance. Anne was already asleep when her dogs started barking. Not their usual bark. This was different, frantic, afraid. She sat up in bed and listened. Through the rain, she heard shouting. The guards were running toward the stables. Anne threw on her coat and boots. By the time she got outside, George and Patterson were already at the stable doors. Inside, one of the horses was screaming, "Thunder!" He was kicking his stall door so hard the whole building shook. George tried to stop her from entering, but Anne pushed past him. This was her stable, her horses. She wasn't staying outside. The scene inside made her stop cold. Thunder's stall door was swinging open. The lock was broken. Twisted metal hung from the wood, but the horse was still inside, wild-eyed and terrified. Patterson checked every stall with his torch. All the other horses were there, scared, but there, nobody else in the building. Anne went to Thunder and spoke softly until he calmed enough to let her touch him. His coat was slick with sweat. His whole body trembled. Mark arrived minutes later, soaked from the rain. He looked at the broken lock and shook his head. That lock was solid steel. It would take serious strength to break it like that. Anne walked slowly through the stable, checking everything. The other horses watched her pass. Near the back where the footprints had been found, she noticed something in the straw. A faint glint of metal. She knelt down and brushed the straw aside. Something was there, small, metallic. Before she could see what it was, George pulled her back. They couldn't investigate properly in the dark. Not during a storm, not safely. They cleared everyone out and posted 2 guards at each entrance. The horses would be watched all night. But when Anne walked back to the house, she kept looking over her shoulder. Someone had been in her stable. Someone strong enough to break a steel lock, and they'd left something behind. What were they looking for? The decision to search. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy. Captain Richards arrived at 7 with 6 more guards. He was head of royal security for the estate, and he didn't look happy. He walked through the stable once, taking notes, asking questions. Then he turned to Princess Anne. A full search had to be done every inch of the building. She knew he was right, but the thought made her stomach tight. This was her sanctuary. Now strangers would be pulling it apart, looking for threats. She gave a single nod. Do it. The guards worked methodically, 2 men per section. They checked the feed rooms, the tack rooms, the loft. They ran their hands along the beams. They looked under every pile of straw. Anne watched from the doorway with Mark beside her. Her face was pale. The horses sensed the tension. They stamped and snorted as the guards moved past their stalls. Bella kept her eyes on Anne the whole time. By noon, they'd found nothing. Captain Richards was starting to look frustrated. Then Ellis, one of the younger guards, called out from the back corner, the same area where the footprints had led. He'd been tapping the walls, checking for weak spots. One section sounded different, hollow. Richards walked over and knocked on the wood himself. Then he knocked on the wall beside it. Completely different sound. He looked at Anne. She nodded again. Ellis used a crowbar to pry the boards loose. The wood was old, but someone had worked on it recently. The nails came out too easily. Behind the boards was darkness. Richard shined his torch inside. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Richard stepped back and turned to Anne. His face had gone white. Inside the wall was a space about 3 ft wide, big enough for a person to hide in. The floor was covered with blankets. There were empty water bottles, food wrappers, a small lamp, and photographs. Dozens of them, all of Princess Anne. Some were taken from far away through the stable windows. Some were closer, too close. Pictures of her with the horses. Pictures of her alone. On the wall, someone had scratched words into the wood over and over. The same 3 words, "She needs me." Mark grabbed Anne's arm as her knees buckled. Richards was already on his radio, calling for backup. Ellis backed away from the wall, his face gray. Anne stared at the hidden room. Someone had been living in her stable, watching her. For how long? Days, weeks. The metallic object from the night before was still lying in the straw nearby. Richards picked it up carefully. It was a locket. Inside was a picture of Anne from years ago riding at a competition. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, "Together forever," Anne's hands started shaking. Mark tried to lead her outside, but she wouldn't move. She kept staring at the photographs on the wall, at the blankets on the floor, at the evidence that someone had been this close to her night after night, and she never knew. Richards turned to his team. Find him now the hidden chamber. Richards pulled more boards away from the wall, and the space behind them turned out to be much bigger than anyone expected. Ellis shined his torch inside, and the beam caught dust floating in the air like snow, while a smell came out that was old and thick. Not the smell of someone living there, but something deeper, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Richards leaned in and then stopped, turning to his team and holding up his hand, so everyone went quiet. There was something at the back of the space, a small wooden chest covered in decades of dust, and even from the doorway, Anne could see markings on the lid, faded gold in the shape of a crest. Her breath caught in her throat. Mark noticed immediately and looked at her face, then at the chest, but he didn't ask questions. Richards carefully climbed into the space and knelt beside the chest, wiping away some of the dust with his glove until the crest became clearer. A lion and a crown with symbols Anne had seen her whole life in history books and old portraits. It belonged to King George V, her great-grandfather. Anne stepped forward without thinking, with Mark following close behind, and Richards looked back at her, waiting for instruction. Nobody spoke, and the stable had gone completely silent, with even the horses seeming to sense something had changed. The chest was surprisingly heavy when Richards lifted it, and he carried it out into the main area of the stable and set it down on a wooden table. Dust puffed up around it, while the metal clasp showed tarnished green with age, but remained intact and locked. Richards pulled out a small tool kit and looked at Anne first, but she shook her head. Captain Richards suggested moving it to the main house somewhere secure with proper lighting and witnesses. Because this was royal property, historical, and it needed protocol. Anne didn't move, her eyes staying fixed on the chest, on the crest, on the lock that had kept secrets hidden for longer than she'd been alive. She thought about her great-grandfather and the stories she'd heard as a child. How he'd loved horses, too, and spent hours in the royal stables, with some saying he preferred the company of animals to people, just like her. Why would he hide something here in a wall in a stable that didn't even belong to the main royal estates? Mark put his hand on her shoulder while Richards and his team waited for her decision. Anne looked at the chest one more time, then at Richards, and nodded. Here now, Richards knelt down and worked the lock carefully, and it was old but well made, the kind of lock that wasn't meant to keep people out forever, just long enough. The metal groaned and then clicked, and Richards lifted the lid slowly while the hinges creaked, the sound echoing through the stable like a whisper from the past. Inside, something gleamed in the lamplight, gold and silver, and something else Anne couldn't identify from where she stood. Nobody moved or breathed as Anne stepped closer and looked inside, her hands starting to tremble. What had her great-grandfather hidden away? And why the contents of the chest? The first thing Anne saw was cloth, old and yellowed, wrapped carefully around objects inside, and Richards lifted the top layer gently to reveal metals beneath it. Equestrian metals in bronze and silver, tarnished with age, but still beautiful, and Anne recognized them immediately as the kind from competitions held before World War I, when royals competed privately away from public eyes. Richard set them aside carefully, and beneath the medals were letters, dozens of them, each one sealed with red wax, bearing the royal seal still intact after all these years. Mark leaned over her shoulder to look at the dates, which went back to 1912, almost a century ago. But it was the photographs that made Anne's heart stop. They were wrapped separately, protected by more cloth, and Richards laid them out on the table one by one, showing men and women in old-fashioned riding clothes, horses lined up for inspection, and stable workers standing at attention. And then one photograph that didn't fit with the others appeared, showing a young woman standing alone beside a white mare wearing riding clothes from the early 1900s, with her hair pulled back and her chin lifted slightly, proud and strong. She looked exactly like Anne. Mark saw it too and glanced at Anne. Then back at the photograph, because the resemblance was impossible to ignore, with the same face, same stance, same way of standing beside a horse like they belonged together. Anne picked up the photograph with shaking hands, but there was no name written on the back, no date, nothing to explain who this woman was or why she looked like Anne's mirror image from another time. Richards pulled out the last item from the chest, a leather-bound journal, thick with a strap wrapped around it to keep it closed, and he handed it to Anne without a word. She untied the strap and opened to the first page, where the handwriting was neat and careful, her great-grandfather's handwriting that she'd seen before in archives. The first entry was dated March 1912 and spoke about horses, about breeding, about a project that had to remain secret involving bloodlines and endurance and traits that went beyond normal understanding. Anne turned the pages slowly while each entry detailed specific horses, their lineage, their capabilities, tests they had undergone, and results that seemed almost impossible. And then she found the name that made everything stop, the White Mare of Windsor. Anne had heard that name before as a child, whispered by stable masters as a legend, a story told to make children respect the royal horses about a mare that never tired, that could run for days without rest, that understood human speech. But it was just a story, a myth. Except here it was written in her great-grandfather's own hand with detailed notes about the mare, about her offspring, about a bloodline that carried something special, something that needed to be protected and hidden. The entries went on for years from 1912 through 1915, and then they stopped abruptly. Anne flipped to the last page where half of it had been torn out, ripped away roughly, leaving jagged edges, and the remaining text ended mid-sentence. The bloodline must continue through, nothing more, just blank space where answers should have been. Anne looked up at Mark while his face was pale, and Richard stood perfectly still, waiting as Ellis and the other guards gathered around, drawn by the silence. Anne looked back at the photograph of the woman who could have been her twin, then at the journal, then at the medals that represented competitions nobody remembered anymore. Her great-grandfather had hidden this, sealed it away in a wall in a stable far from the main royal properties. And Anne couldn't understand why. What was he protecting or hiding, and why did that woman in the photograph look exactly like her? Whispers of the past. Anne sat alone in her study that night with the journal open under a single lamp, and the house around her was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. She'd sent everyone away, even Mark, because whatever secrets her great-grandfather had written needed to be understood in private first. The early entries were straightforward enough, discussing breeding programs and bloodlines with the clinical precision of a scientist, but as the years progressed, the tone changed into something darker and more obsessive. King George V had been searching for something specific in his horses, not just speed or strength, but something he called the old gift that appeared in bloodlines stretching back centuries. He wrote about purity and endurance in ways that sounded less like animal husbandry and more like a religious quest. And by 1914, the entries had become frantic with mentions of unnamed advisors warning him to stop, to destroy the records, to let the bloodline fade out naturally. But he refused because he believed he was close to something, close to proving that certain traits could be preserved and passed down through careful selection, not just in horses, but in royal families themselves. Anne's hands trembled as she read those passages, understanding what her great-grandfather had been suggesting without ever stating it directly. The breeding project hadn't been only about horses at all, but about preserving something in the royal bloodline, something ancient that he believed made them different from common people. One letter tucked between the pages was more disturbing than the rest, written by someone whose name had been blacked out, and it spoke of an unnamed royal who'd gone completely mad in 1915. This person had locked themselves in the stables with the last surviving pure white mare, refusing to eat or sleep, claiming the animal carried a secret gift that would fade if anyone else touched it. Guards had finally broken down the doors to find the royal barely alive, whispering to the horse in a language nobody recognized. The letter ended abruptly with a warning that the mare should be destroyed and the bloodline ended, but there was no record of whether that had actually happened. Anne closed the journal and walked to the window overlooking the stables, and dawn was just beginning to break over the fields. She thought about Bella, her pure white mare, the one she rode every morning, the one whose bloodline she traced back through meticulous records kept by the royal stud farms. Bella's ancestry went back further than any other horse on the estate, back to the early 1900s, back to exactly the time period her great-grandfather had been writing about. She'd always thought Bella was special, more intelligent than other horses, more intuitive about Anne's moods and needs, but she'd attributed that to their bond and years together. Now she wasn't so sure what she'd been seeing in those dark, knowing eyes. Anne picked up the photograph of the woman who looked like her twin and held it up to the lamplight, searching for any details she might have missed. The woman's hand rested on the white mare's neck in exactly the same way Anne touched Bella every morning with the same familiar gesture of connection and trust. She ordered Richards to keep everything confidential the next morning, every photograph, every letter, every word from the journal. And the guards who'd witnessed the discovery agreed immediately, though she could see the questions in their eyes. They'd felt it, too, the weight of something ancient and forbidden that had been hidden for good reason. But could a secret this old truly stay buried? The guard's dilemma. Ellis couldn't sleep after what he'd seen in the stable. And 3 nights after they'd found the chest, he lay in his quarters staring at the ceiling, while his mind replayed the image of those photographs and that journal. He'd been trained not to question royal business, to simply follow orders and maintain security, but something about the hidden room and the desperate scratches on the wall kept pulling at him. Around midnight, he gave up trying to sleep and walked outside, telling himself he just needed fresh air. But his feet carried him toward the stables without conscious decision. The building was dark except for one lamp left burning near the entrance, and the night guard nodded at him as he passed, but didn't ask questions. Ellis walked slowly through the stable, listening to the horses breathing in their stalls, and he told himself he was being ridiculous, that there was nothing here to see. But when he reached the back corner where they'd found the hidden room, he stopped cold because there were new marks on the wall, fresh scratches in the wood that definitely hadn't been there before. He ran his fingers over them and felt his heart start pounding because these weren't random marks, but deliberate gouges, deep and violent, as though something inside the wall had been trying to claw its way out. The wood was splintered in places, and when he pressed his ear against it, he could swear he heard something. A faint scraping sound that made every hair on his neck stand up. Ellis backed away and nearly ran to find Captain Richards, who was doing his rounds on the other side of the estate. Richards listened to his report with a neutral expression that didn't quite hide his concern, and they returned to the stable together with 2 other guards as backup. Richards examined the marks carefully with his torch, running his hand over the gouges, and Ellis watched his face grow pale. These were fresh, made within the last day or 2, but the hidden room had been sealed back up after they'd removed the chest, and nobody had permission to open it again. Richards tried to calm Ellis down, suggesting that perhaps an animal had gotten into the walls, maybe a large rat or even a fox, but his voice lacked conviction. The other guards exchanged glances, but said nothing because they all knew what they were thinking. That something about this stable had changed since they'd opened that chest, that the air felt heavier and the horses more nervous, and the shadows seemed to move wrong in the lamplight. The unease spread through the security team over the following days, and even the most experienced guards found excuses to avoid the back corner of the stable. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but they all felt watched when they were in there, as though invisible eyes followed their movements and judged their presence. The second discovery: a week passed, but the strange noises in the stable didn't stop, and if anything, they grew louder and more frequent until even the horses refused to settle at night. Anne tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just the old building settling or animals in the walls. But on the 7th night, Thunder kicked his stall door so hard it cracked the wood, and she knew something had to be done. Richards ordered another search the next morning, this time more thorough than before, and his team arrived with equipment meant for structural inspection, because if there was one hidden room, there could be others. Ellis volunteered immediately despite the fear Anne could see in his eyes, and she appreciated his courage, even though part of her wanted to send everyone away and leave the past buried. They started in the back corner where the chest had been found, and Richard suggested checking beneath the floor this time since they'd only examined the walls before. 2 guards used crowbars to lift the old floorboards, which came up easier than expected, almost as if someone had removed them before and put them back without securing them properly. Beneath the wooden floor was dirt packed hard from decades of pressure, but when Richards brushed it away with his hand, he found something solid underneath. Stone, cold and gray, with markings carved into its surface that had been worn smooth by time, but were still visible in the right light. Anne knelt down beside him to look closer, and her breath caught when she recognized the royal crest engraved into the stone along with words in Latin that she translated slowly in her head. Quod celato mir debe, what is hidden must remain so. Mark pulled her back gently, but she shook her head because she needed to see this through, needed to understand what her great-grandfather had been protecting. Richards called for more equipment, and within an hour they had ropes secured around the stone slab, and 6 guards worked together to lift it, while Anne watched with her hands pressed against her mouth. The slab came up slowly, grinding against the earth around it, and beneath it was a shallow space carved into the ground about 6 ft long and 3 ft wide. Inside lay bones, white and ancient, arranged carefully as though someone had taken great care in placing them. And at first glance, Anne thought they were human remains, which made her stomach turn. But then she looked closer and saw the shape was wrong, too long in some places and curved in others, and Richard shined his torch directly into the space so they could all see clearly. It was a horse, or what remained of one, its skeleton perfectly preserved, and laid out with its legs folded beneath it, as though it had simply laid down to sleep and never woken up. Around the neck bones was a bridle, or what was left of one, made of leather that had mostly rotted away, but with silver fittings that still gleamed when the light hit them. On those silver pieces was engraved the same crest from the stone slab, and beneath the skull someone had placed a small metal plaque with words Anne recognized immediately from her great-grandfather's journal. The White Mare of Windsor. Anne's voice broke when she tried to speak, and she had to clear her throat twice before the words would come out properly. And even then, they were barely more than a whisper. Her mother had told her stories about this